At a Wednesday evening church meeting, now here's a faith joke. Try to find this on the internet. At a Wednesday evening church meeting, a very wealthy man rose to give his testimony. "I'm a millionaire," he said, "and I attribute it all to the rich blessing of God in my life. And I can still remember the turning point of my faith like it was yesterday. I had just earned my first $1, and I went to a church meeting that night. The speaker was a missionary who told about his work. I knew I only had the $1 bill, and I either had to give it all to God's work or nothing at all. So at that moment, I decided to give my whole $1 to God. I believe that God blessed that decision, and that is why I'm a rich man today." Well, as he was finished, it was clear that everybody was moved by the man's story. And as he took a seat, a little old lady sitting next to him in the same pew leaned over and said, "That's a wonderful story. I dare you to do it again." There's a lesson in truth. So we've been working assiduously. That's a two-bit word, meaning really hard. We've been working assiduously since the beginning of January, going through what Dr. Emily Cady has to share with us in Lessons in Truth. And we're actually now to the center of the book. Chapter 6 is a chapter on faith. Everything that she is inviting us to experience revolves around the activity of faith and our conscious opening and commitment to faith. Without faith, there will be no activating of the Christ consciousness, as Kristen shared with us in the meditation, permanently. There will be no awareness that we are the expression of God, that feeling that Kristen brought us to in the meditation. Without faith, we will not go there. What makes this especially challenging for us is that we human beings are actually designed to believe. We are believing machines. From our earliest awakening to self-awareness around the age 3, 4, 5, the mechanism of belief has already been activated. And our earliest impressions are already being formatted according to a belief system we had no conscious say in creating. And this belief system, as we will see from Dr. Cady's brilliant insights, is inextricably linked to desire, to our desires for what we want in our lives. This fact that faith is activated before our awareness is the reason Dr. Cady starts us out learning about the practice of denial. Remember, chapter 4, denials. For we must transform our earliest beliefs into a more accurate set of understandings that cohere with the purity of spirit within. So to open chapter 6, chapter entitled Faith, she calls upon St. Paul, writing in the letter to Hebrews, to explain what she means by faith. We've heard this many, many times. St. Paul says, faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. Hoped for. Dr. Cady elaborates. In other words, faith takes right hold of the substance of things desired and brings into the world of evidence the things that before weren't seen. Further speaking of faith, the writer of the Hebrews says, quote, things which are seen were not made of things which do appear. Dr. Cady says, that is, things that are seen are not made out of visible things, but out of the invisible. In some way, then, we understand that whatever we want is in this surrounding invisible substance, and faith is the power that can bring it into actuality to us. So believing, as we heard in the daily word, believing is the activity of faith. It is the taking of, to use Dr. Cady's words, right hold of the substance of things that were not seen. Our systems of belief, our faith, act in our subconscious. And until we develop disciplines through meditation, denials and affirmations, they will always remain unseen. So she goes on to elaborate about St. Paul's insight about faith being the substance of things hoped for and the evidence of things not seen. Because in that passage in Hebrews that she cites, St. Paul goes on to enumerate a list of results brought into manifestation by commitments of faith. So he mentions a series of Old Testament figures who, quoting St. Paul now, through faith subdued kingdoms, wrought righteousness, obtained promises, stopped the mouths of lions, quenched the power of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, from weakness were made strong, waxed mighty in war, turned to flight armies of aliens, end quote. So Dr. Katie says, even if your desires exceed those results, you need not despair or hesitate to claim their fulfillment. For one greater than you, one who knew whereof he spoke, said, all things are possible to him that believes. From St. Mark. All things are possible to us when we believe. So it is often said, faith is the power to move mountains. You've heard that before? How many believe that? I don't. It's very human of us to be skeptical that faith has the actual power to move mountains, maybe as a metaphorical device, but who has moved the Sierra to Kansas? So, this is what Dr. Katie says. From the moment we began to ask, we began to question our ability to reach God's standard of faith on which hung our fate. We also began to question whether, after all, there is any such power in faith to prevail with the giver of every good gift, so as to draw out of him something that he had never let us have before. So she goes on to say, as we explore what does it mean to move mountains, to have faith that can move mountains, the access to true faith requires us to bypass the logical mind. So the logical mind says you're not going to move the Sierra to Kansas. You're not even going to move them to Reno. So we must bypass the logical mind, because what does she say? Remember, the very first chapter, very first paragraph, faith, our mind believes in its bondage to flesh and the things of the flesh. The human mind not only considers faith in the traditional religious meaning, as Dr. Katie says, meaning as a sort of will-o'-the-wisp, good enough for women and children to hang their hopes on, but not a thing from which any real definite results could be ever attained. So our mind plays the prove-it-to-me game. And notice, the prove-it-to-me game derives from a hidden belief that one has to prove something in order for it to be so. So since mentation, the act of thinking, always unwittingly includes internal logical contradictions, using it for our evaluation of and reliance upon faith, the faith that she's speaking of here is a futile endeavor. Notice, thinking occurs only after believing. Faith lives in our intuition beyond the mere mind. That's why she raises a distinction between what she calls blind faith and what she calls understanding faith. These are mental concepts or constructs to lead us to rely upon our intuition rather than logical thinking to find the way of living in faith. So when she uses the phrase understanding faith, that she does throughout this chapter, let us think of that she means conscious faith, faith that is aware of itself. So the understanding faith is the faith that understands what it's up to. She says faith does not depend on physical facts or on the evidence of the senses because it is born of intuition. And here's what she says intuition is. The spirit of truth ever living at the center of our being. Not mind, intuition. Its action, the action of intuition, is infinitely higher than that of intellectual conclusions. It is founded on truth, while reasoning or intellectual argument is founded on evidence of the senses and is not reliable. For the purposes of activating faith, evidence of the senses is not reliable. She goes on to look at intuition a little bit more, in a little more detail. Intuition, she writes, is, quote, the open end within one's own being of the invisible channel ever connecting each individual with God. And intuition uses this ever-connecting channel to receive and activate faith, like she says, like a ray of light shot out of the central sun, which is God. So we experience the truth of both blind and understanding or conscious faith through the faculty of intuition. But understanding faith, conscious faith, goes a step further by showing up in our intuition because fixed, immutable laws, as she says, require this to happen. Eternal truth in its expression as universal law predates me, predates you, predates all humanity, predates the earth. It showed up at least at the Big Bang, and it probably predates that. And so, what she's getting at is our emergence and the way we happen to develop is entirely according to universal law. This explains why we can access understanding and activate faith without depending on our thinking to get us there. This is how she says it. She says, the mental and spiritual world or realms are governed by laws that are just as real and unfailing as the laws that govern the natural world. And in the paragraphs before that, she talked about how 1 and 1 is always 2, and no matter what anyone thinks about it, that's a natural truth. Certain conditions of mind, she says, are so connected with certain results that the two are inseparable. If we have the one, we must have the other, as surely as the night follows the day. Not because we believe some wise person's testimony that such is the case, not even because the voice of intuition tells us that it is so, but because the whole matter is based on laws that can neither fail nor be broken. So the mind will argue with the truth. It doesn't matter what you think. The truth always prevails. And remember, what is the fundamental truth that we're working with here? The fundamental truth is God is. There is only one presence, one power, one love active in my life. God is. And God comprises all the elementary qualities that our minds can discern. The 12 powers. God is good, God is love, God is power, God is creativity, etc. Here's how she says it. God, the one creative cause of all things, is spirit. And visible to spiritual consciousness, as Kristen said, we open the eye of consciousness, or spiritual consciousness, and we see God. As we have learned, God is the sum total of all good. There is no good that you can desire in your life which at its center is not God. God is the substance of all things, the real thing within every visible form of good. God, the invisible substance out of which all visible things, the invisible substance out of which all visible things are formed, is all around us waiting to come into manifestation. How does that make you feel? To know that we're sitting and moving and breathing and having our being in the substance that our physical senses can't behold, but it's always there and accessible. So I'd like us to take a minute and do a little singing about that. I'd like us to turn to hymn number 149. So I want us to feel what it means to know that God, the one creative cause, is spirit and is visible to our spiritual consciousness. This is the song, My Source, I believe, right? So let's just sing the first verse if we can. Just feel that this source is our faith. Substance. It is above us and below us, to the left, to the right. It is within us and without us. Everything we see, everything we hear, everything we feel comes into consciousness out of the invisible realms in which our bodies are embedded. You ever seen your intuition? It's invisible. You'll never see it. And yet it's there. Whither shall I go from thy spirit, the psalmist asks in Psalm 139. Or whither shall I flee from thy presence? If I ascend into heaven, thou art there. If I make my bed in hell, behold, thou art there. If I rise on the wings of the dawn, if I settle on the far side of the sea, even there your hand will guide me, your right hand will hold me fast. So the Spirit is always there. God is always there. No matter what our minds say, our minds can argue, your minds can disagree. I can tell you I don't believe that we can move mountains. It's got nothing to do with it. Dr. Katie says, this good substance is all about us, and it's unlimited, and it is itself the supply of every demand that can be made, every need that exists in the visible or natural world. But here's the key. More profoundly than awareness of itself is necessary but not sufficient. The presencing of physical or emotional manifestations out of the eternal, omnipotent, but invisible substance in which we totally dwell is directly and entirely related to our desires. It's related to what we want. Dr. Katie says, desire in the heart is always God tapping at the door of your consciousness with his infinite supply, a supply that is forever useless unless there be demand for it. So desire alone is insufficient to the manifestation of it. We must also make the demand for it. So creation out of the invisible substance requires first that we identify what we want, and second, that we affirmatively ask for it to come into being. To take these two steps, she says, is to act by understanding or conscious faith. Quote, she says, faith takes hold of the substance of the things hoped for and brings into evidence or visibility the things not seen. Evidence, the word evidence comes from two Latin words meaning out of seeing. To bring it out of seeing into seeing. She refers to Jesus as recorded in the Gospel of John, affirming this eternal truth, that in the unseen, the supply of every want, every desire, awaits demand. So this is Dr. Katie again. When he said, ask and you shall receive, he was simply stating an unalterable truth. He knew that the instant we ask or desire, for asking is desire expressed, we touch a secret spring which starts on its way toward us the good we want. He knew that there need not be any crossing or pleading about it, that our asking is simply our complying with an unfailing law, which is bound to work. There is no escape from it. Asking and receiving are two ends of the same thing. To ask is to receive, in other words. So there's a profound interrelationship between our personal desires and those of God. And this interrelationship impacts faith. Dr. Katie says, desire in the heart for anything is God's sure promise sent beforehand to indicate that it is yours already in the limitless realm of supply. And whatever you want, you can have for the taking. So we are activating understanding or conscious faith only when we are consciously calling upon it, using it to consciously create what we want. Faith underwrites our realization of the limitless realm of supply out of which whatever we want, we can have for the taking. Let's feel that one in song, and we'll sing the same song, the second verse. Page 149. Same song, second verse. truth, of course, is that just as children of, or projections, as she says in the earlier chapter, projections of God, we are always creating. Just as we cannot not believe, we cannot not create. Everything we have in our lives is a precise and perfect manifestation of our desires. For God is always giving us what we want. Always. Whatever we have in our lives that seems out of accord with our conscious desires or beliefs is the result of subconscious desires or belief. So any discord we experience between what we say we want, what we think we want, and what we actually have is an invitation to look deeper within to discover the hidden beliefs and desires that are in accord with the law of faith manifesting in our lives. If I have any insufficiency in my life, I can now see it as my opportunity to lean into my deeper desires and call upon God to create something better. Dr. Katie says, the only way God has of letting us know of his infinite supply, the only way God has of letting us know his infinite supply and his desire to make it ours is for him to push gently on the divine spark living within each of us. He wants you to be a strong, self-sufficient man or woman, to have more power and dominion over all before you. So he quietly and silently pushes a little more of himself, his desire, into the center of your being. He enlarges, so to speak, your real self. And once you become conscious of the new desire to be bigger, grander, stronger, if he had not pushed at the center of your being first, you would never have thought of new desires, but would have remained perfectly content as you were. We would have remained perfectly content in bondage to belief that the flesh and the things of the flesh are all there is. So remember, in the previous two chapters, Dr. Katie schooled us on how to invoke the law of desire, sufficiency, and manifestation by first explaining the use of denials, followed by affirmations. I learned to deny my subconscious beliefs and to affirm my deeper desires. I deny my unhealed childhood defenses, fears, and shame, and affirm my adult desires, joys, and transcendence. The exposure of no longer serving beliefs through denials lifts them up for healing and transformation via affirmations. Dr. Katie says, affirm your possession of the good that you desire. Have faith in it because you are working with divine law and cannot fail. Do not be argued off your basic principle by anyone, much less your own mind. And sooner will the heavens fall than you fail to get that which you desire. Quoting Jesus in Mark, she says, all things whatsoever you pray and ask for, believe that you receive them and you shall have them. As I said, just as we are always manifesting, we are always believing. We have been believing and we have been manifesting since before we were self-aware. So we are always applying faith. Faith gets us up in the morning, for we assume without even thinking about it that all the elements of our lives will be in place as they always have been in the past. As it was yesterday, we believe so it will be today. We assume that we will find the material support for everything we will choose to do. We have faith in the dynamics of our days, that they will operate precisely as they always have. So the work of spiritual growth and opening ourselves to the divine spirit within is to move from blind faith to understanding or conscious faith. We activate conscious faith by noticing what we want and asking for it. So with ever greater confidence, we ask for what we want with ever greater expectation of its automatic supply. Conscious faith is the victory that overcomes the world, as we sang earlier. The world of bondage to the flesh and the things of the flesh that Dr. Katie said is what we are working toward denying. She finishes the chapter with this observation. Knowing divine law and obeying it, we can forever rest from all anxiety, all fear. For thou, quoting Psalms, thou openest thy hand and satisfies the desire of every living thing. Knowing divine law and obeying it, we can forever rest from all anxiety and fear that comes from bondage, belief in bondage to the flesh and the things of the flesh. And we transfer our belief and our faith and our openness to the dependency, complete dependency on that eternal, unfixed, immutable law that when we ask, we receive, because invisible substance and supply is always there, even when our mind says it's not. How do you move the mountains to Kansas? We use our faith to move the mountains of our disbelief within our lives, our belief and commitment and clinging to lack, limitation. We deny their power and we affirm something much more powerful, and we tell God what we want. And when we ask, we receive. So let's seal this by singing the last verse of my source, 149. Let's feel the truth of this through the vibrational power of singing. Prove me. So the affirmation for today is, for this chapter on faith, I activate conscious faith by asking God to fulfill my heart's desires right here, right now. I activate conscious faith by asking God to fulfill my heart's desires right here, right now. So let's affirm that together. I'll read the first part. I won't make you remember the whole thing. I wouldn't. So I activate conscious faith by asking God to fulfill my heart's desires right here, right now. And so it is. Thank you, God. Amen.